This talk was sponsored by the Center for Chinese Studies along with many other centers at the International Institute, the Centers for Comparative and International Studies, for the Center for South Asian Studies, for Southeast Asian Studies, and the Nam Center for Korean Studies. So we also want to thank all of our fellow centers for co-sponsoring today's presentation. Today's presentation is going to be given by Mara Hvistendahl. She's a Beijing-based correspondent for science and the author of this new book, Unnatural Selection, Choosing Boys Over Girls and the Consequences of a World Full of Men. Her award-winning writing has also appeared in Harper's, Scientific American, Popular Science, The Financial Times, and Foreign Policy. She's proficient in both Chinese and Spanish, and she spent half of the last decade in China covering everything from archaeology to the space program. She's a former journalism professor at Fudan University in Shanghai, and Ms. Hvistendahl sits on the advisory board of Round Earth Media, an organization founded to promote international journalism. So please join me in welcoming Mara Hvistendahl. Thank you.
Hi, well, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me. This is my first time at the University of Michigan, and I'm excited to see the campus and get to know people here. So I wrote this book. It just came out this year, and I got the idea to write it while I was working as a journalist in China. And I'm sure you know the big story in China right now is development, that the country is moving forward at a very rapid speed, lots of big changes. As a science journalist, I report on a lot of these. I mean, I spend my days reporting on breakthroughs in genomics and agriculture, on the space program. And you know, there are lots of growing pains as well, but I think that the big story, more or less, is that China is moving ahead. And then, on the other hand, if you look at the population, you see a trend that's essentially regressive. And what interested me is that these two things are happening simultaneously. So this is a map showing the sex ratio for children ages 1 through 4 by province. And the dark blue spots are kind of danger zones. I mean, that's where you see over 130 boys for every 100 girls. Countrywide, the sex ratio at birth in the last census was 118 boys for every 100 girls, so almost 5 to 4. You have a huge gap. And there are danger spots within some of these other provinces as well. So then I got interested in how this is happening now at this moment in Chinese history. Every time new surveys come out, the numbers are reported in the news. The Chinese press picks them up, the foreign press picks them up, but really without much explanation as to why. I mean, we know this is a result of sex-selective abortion mostly, but beyond that, you know, why people are getting abortions based on the sex of the fetus is not so much explained. So I wanted to understand a little bit more what was going on. The one-child policy is often given as an explanation in China, but that didn't do it for me. The one-child policy's been around since 1980, and the sex ratio at birth really began to spike in the 1990s. And then at the same time, you have the same trend happening in other Asian countries as well. So India, Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea, all have skewed sex ratios at birth. And then the really kind of astonishing thing is that if you look at other regions of the world, you're seeing the same trends cropping up there as well. So in the past 10 to 15 years, the Balkans, particularly Albania, has shown a very skewed sex ratio at birth. So sex-selective abortion happening there as well. And then also the Caucasus countries, so Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. In Armenia, one survey found a sex ratio at birth that was more skewed than China's. So you have to remember it's a smaller country, and that survey data may not be as accurate, but still that's a very big gap, and it happened also very rapidly, and really, from what I understand, was unexpected for a lot of demographers. This was seen as a kind of Asian problem, and then suddenly you see these numbers happening in other places. So these are other countries that are also developing very quickly. So I was trying to get a sense then, well, what's happening in all of these places? Is there some sort of global explanation for what's going on? And so I started reporting by going to a county in northern Jiangsu province called Suining. This is a place that was once agricultural. It's kind of the bread belt, or sorry, grain belt of China. People produce grain, rice, and wheat. And recently it started industrializing. You have these really kind of small-scale factories setting up, and a lot of people are going to Shanghai working as migrant laborers, working as kind of nannies, construction workers, and they're bringing back money, buying new houses. To some degree, actually, the pace of development is more stark in a place like Suining than it is in Shanghai or in Beijing. Because it's happening very fast. I spoke with people there who said that they would go to Shanghai to work for 2 or 3 years, and they come back and they have trouble finding their house because so much has changed. But at the same time, Suining has a sex ratio at birth of 152 boys for 100 girls. And sometimes demography can seem seem very abstract, and here it was real. I mean, there were really boys everywhere. This is an elementary school that I visited. You see one girl in the, I don't know if I can, there she is. One girl in the back, and maybe one in the other row, and a few probably clustered off to the other side of the classroom, but by and large, this is what the schools looked like around the area. So I wanted to know then, what do the people in Suining think about this? Are they excited about all the boys being born? Are they worried about the future, about their sons getting married later on, or are they disturbed on a more fundamental level, on a kind of humanitarian level, that so few girls are being born? And I went to Suining at first with a photographer named Ariana Lindquist, and she'd worked in China for quite a while, and she'd been to Suining a few times, and she suggested we spend time with a woman who I call Liu Li in the book. Liu Li is a strong, really independent woman. She's a leader in her church. She kind of calls the shots in her relationship, and we thought because she's sort of so outspoken, independent, she would be a good guide to what was happening in the community. She wasn't afraid to cart around 2 foreigners for a few weeks. I mean, she kind of liked having us around, and so we spent a bit of time with her. She introduced me to her friends and relatives. This is a cousin of her husband's who was really excited about having twin boys. I mean, he said he would walk down the street with a son on each shoulder, and people would look at him with envy, and he felt like $1 million. And she took me back to her village as well, and I met women who'd been brought by traffickers from Western China to marry men who couldn't find local women. This is something I'll get to later on. And I spent time with her own family. And then at the end of the trip, I realized I actually didn't know her that well in a sense, because we were having dinner, and she made a nice meal, and we were having some warm beer, which is common in rural China, and I was talking about my reporting and what I was looking into in training and what I'd found, and this phenomenon of sex selection happening. And she kind of stood up and she said, well, I aborted 2 girls, and I had 2 sex-selective abortions, and that really threw me for a loop, because I thought, here's this independent woman, clearly in charge in her household, and this is something that she is doing as well. And it changed how I'd thought about sex selection until that point. It's sometimes portrayed in the media as something that's happening in rural areas, in villages, and that women are being forced by their husbands to do it, that it happens because of poverty. And then here was this woman who, for whom that really wasn't the case, and she's saying this is something I did as well. And it actually turned out to be quite typical of what's happening across other countries where this is where sex selection is occurring. This is an issue, first of all, if you look at this map of China again, it's an issue, first of all, because it means that sex selection could spread. So it could spread from the areas where they're wealthier, more middle class, more upper class, to poor areas. And in China, that's happened to some degree. I mean, if you see here, Shanghai, Beijing are not so, the sex ratio of birth is not so skewed anymore, except among the migrant population. And then still, and now it's moved in a bit west. Henan, Hunan, Jiangxi, Guangdong. These places are where people are selecting for sex. And then still the poorer provinces are relatively untouched. So Guangxi and Guizhou, still there's not much selection happening. So it's an issue at that level, because it means this could pick up in poor areas. And also in India, if you look at Delhi has traditionally been a place, not traditionally, so in the past 30 years been a place where people really have selected for sex, and the sex ratio is kind of extremely out of whack. But the northeast of the country has sex ratios are more balanced. So there's a threat of this spreading to new areas. And the other issue that this brings up, that Lioli's case brings up, is that if this is something that a strong, independent woman is choosing to do, then the danger zones that you see, then the phenomenon of sex selection in general it's a sum of all these individual choices. And I mean, that has implications for how you tackle the problem. And it also has implications for how we should think about it. And it says something, I think, about our own behavior in the West. And if we say it's a choice, this is something people are choosing to do, it's not the sort of choice that we mean when we talk about abortion usually. It's not the kind of choice that says, I'm pregnant and I don't want to be pregnant because I'm poor, or because I can't give a child a good home, because this is not the right time. It's a choice that says, I'm pregnant, but I want the baby only if it's a boy. Or, to give an example that has been more had more saliency in the West recently. I want a baby, but not if it has certain conditions. Or an example that may be more relevant in the future is that I want a baby, but only if he has blue eyes, if he's a boy, and if he's tall. And so it's this kind of choice. It's really a sort of consumerism that is crept into parenting. And that's how I see it in cases like upper middle class, wealthy people in elites within developing countries practicing sex selection. And in that sense, it's very, very close to trends that have caught on in the U.S. recently. In the U.S., sex selection happens as well, We don't have a skewed sex ratio at birth if you look at the overall population of the country. If you break it down by ethnicity, you do get skewed sex ratios. But we still select for sex. This is not limited to any ethnicity. In fact, the U.S. has incredibly lenient regulations governing sex selection. And I don't mean abortion because we have very tight restrictions on abortion, but IVF is the way that we typically do it here. So during in vitro fertilization, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, you get to the point where you have several celled embryos. You can withdraw one cell, and you can test it for sex. This is called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, and it's offered by fertility clinics here. And so this site, Gender Baby, is actually sponsored by a fertility clinic in California. Oops, let's go back. It explains, if you want to select for sex, how you go about doing it. What are some of the benefits of having a boy? What are the benefits of having a girl? You can ask a doctor for advice. If you go to the boy page, you learn that humans have been wanting boys for thousands of years, that kings wanted sons to carry on to inherit the throne, that your ancestors wanted boys. It's almost as if to say that don't worry, your ancestors wanted sons. It's okay. You should have a son as well. But the thing is that your ancestors did not have the ability to get a son if they wanted to. There were certainly attempts. Aristotle actually prescribed tying off the left testicle if a man wanted a son. I don't know. I mean, he believed that each testicle contained either male or female sperm, and this was how you did it. And I don't know how many men actually went through with that, but the idea was there. It's an ancient idea, but the thing is, we've only recently had the technology to control reproduction in this way. Now, if you go to the girl page on Gender Baby, interestingly, you don't actually find a page explaining the benefits of having a daughter, explaining why girls are good. Instead, you get this page describing family balancing. And this is a new term created by the fertility industry, I believe, in the 1990s. And it's the notion that we have the right to children of both sexes. So if you have 3 girls and you want a boy, that's fine. You should be able to get that boy. You have 3 boys and you want a girl, you can have him. Sorry, you can have her. So it's actually not that different from what happens in Asia and Eastern Europe, in countries where sex-selective abortion is common. Typically, a sex ratio at birth doesn't spike until you get to the 2nd or 3rd birth. So most couples are waiting until they already have 1 or 2 girls, and then they select for sex. This is true in China. I mean, with the one-child policy, there are a lot of exceptions to it, and one exception is that in many provinces, if you have a daughter first, you can try again for a son. So it's even this kind of discrimination is sort of built into the policy. We also have, I'm going to get back to talking about Asia, but I just want to continue in the US for just a minute. We also have a term here that's cropped up in, I think, maybe just the past 10 years called gender disappointment. So Elle magazine recently ran a feature on women who are disappointed with the sex of their baby and go on Prozac after giving birth. It's popularly called GD, and this was in this issue that featuring Katie Holmes. What I found actually when I researched my book is that the fascination with sex selection and with controlling reproduction in the U.S. actually went back to the 1960s, and that had implications for what would happen later on in Asia and in Eastern Europe. And as it's the story of U.S. technology spreading throughout the rest of the world is not a new one, but it's true in this case as well. This is an early ultrasound machine from the 1960s. This is a 1965 cover of Life magazine. The first thing, ultrasound was relatively recent at this point, couldn't do that much. It wasn't until the early 1980s that we could see the sex of the baby with any accuracy, and that those machines were mass-produced and distributed throughout the developing world. But early on, it was greeted with this fascination. And the first thing about this is that it's huge, and I think it must have been a very daunting experience to be a pregnant woman and have this big sack of fluid and it's suspended over your belly. But the second thing is this headline that control of life, audacious experiments promise decades of added life, super babies with improved minds and bodies, and even a kind of immortality. So I think, from the outset, even though really what ultrasound promised was better maternal and child health, the fascination was focused on controlling reproduction, the idea that we would be able to control the outcome of sex, the outcome of reproduction to some degree. And at the time, nobody, at least popularly, was thinking about ultrasound in connection with sex selection. They were looking at other technologies. But there was a fascination with sex selection at the same time. So also starting in the 1960s in the West. This had to do more with population control than anything else. It was, as you may know, the 1960s was an era where population growth was very much on the agenda. It was a huge concern. We had reliable projections for the first time from the UN, showing that populations were growing rapidly. And at the same time, people were also living longer than ever before in the developing world because of advances in public health. So there's a lot of money going into reducing birth rates quickly and effectively, especially in the developing world. There was a lot of concern about Asia in particular. And you had money coming from USAID, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation. Planned Parenthood was founded as a population control organization. Population Council was a big research organization. And especially in countries where the U.S. had a lot of influence at the time, political influence, like South Korea, Taiwan, India, we were very actively promoting all kinds of strategies. So this is a magazine from the Taiwan Family Planning Association in the 1962. One of the strategies that was actually put on the table at the time was sex selection. So you had lots of research into birth control, sterilization, abortion. I mean, everything, really the whole gamut, everything was tried. Also just propaganda promoting smaller families. But sex selection was an idea as well. And the idea there was that population organizations had done research showing that one of the reasons that people in the developing world continued to have children was that they wanted a son. So the idea then emerged, then why not guarantee them a son on the first try or second try? And I mean, I think you have to remember this is the era of control of life, fascination with science, but in this sort of controlling, manipulative way. The biological revolution was underway, and so this idea was, let's just give them a son. So this is Sheldon Siegel. He was the medical director of the Population Council at the time, and the sex selection idea, it went from being, just something people were batting about to something that the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development was hosting seminars on. So he led a session at a 1969, so it was a seminar on population controls and family planning strategies in general, but he led a session within that seminar on sex selection. He actually, under his at that session, under his leadership, the delegates decided that this was one of the methods that was particularly desirable. So, not only was it a method that was on the table, but it was one that was favored, and it was seen as even ethical by some people. And I think, it was against a backdrop of all sorts of coercive strategies being tried. This is a time when 6 million men were sterilized in India, when women were being encouraged to have abortions, were being encouraged or even forced to be sterilized. So it was against that backdrop, sex selection seemed to some people a good idea. Sheldon Siegel had actually spent a few years in Delhi at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which is India's top medical school. He founded the Department of Reproductive Medicine there, and he taught students there how to determine sex in humans. It was not yet fetal sex determination, but it was the method he taught was a kind of precursor to that. The Ames, that medical school, later became the site of hundreds of sex-selective abortions in the 70s. Doctors brought in, they offered poor women in Delhi the opportunity to learn the sex of their fetus for the first time. I mean, this was really the introduction of sex selection to India. And then they charted whether the women aborted based on sex. It turned out that they did when the fetus was a girl, and then wrote up this study as a great method of population control. So there was a sort of, this was the department founded by Sheldon Siegel. It received a lot of funding from the Rockefeller Foundation as well, millions of dollars, and there was a connection. So sex selection was not something that just sort of started happening in Asia without Western scientists knowing about it. So the appeal, I think, of this strategy, the time when you had all these more coercive strategies being introduced, was that it was voluntary. So to go back to that notion of individual choice, of having control over reproduction, I think people foresaw that it would be something that, or the scientists who proposed this foresaw that it would be something that parents would want. They would not have to be forced to use it. They would actually, maybe really appreciate having this ability. In 1973, there was a microbiologist named John Postgate who wrote a cover story for the British magazine New Scientist on what he called the man-child pill. So his idea was that, people needed a pill to women. It was a pill that women could take before sex to ensure that any children that resulted would be male. And for him, the great appeal with this was that it was voluntary. And he wrote, countless millions of people would leap at the opportunity to breed male, and no compulsion or even propaganda would be necessary to encourage its use. But he also, John Postgate also recognized that there would be drawbacks to a world where men outnumbered women. And what I found interesting was that not only did people think this was a great strategy, but they also recognized that there would be side effects. I mean, they in the end, they thought the benefits outweighed the side effects. I guess that was their analysis. But in the same New Scientist article, John Postgate wrote, "It is probable that a form of purdah would become necessary. Women's right to work, even to travel alone freely, would probably be forgotten transiently. Polyandry might well become accepted in some societies. Some might treat their women as queen ants, others as rewards for the most outstanding or most determined males." So it seems like a good way to segue into what some of the effects of sex selection have been or will be today. One is that if you have years in which many more boys and girls are born, eventually you have many more men than women, and projected 15% of men in China by the 2020s, and 15% of men in Northwest India will not have female counterparts in the population by the 2020s for both countries. Demographers call these men surplus. I think it's a bit it sounds a bit crass, but that's the term for a man who does not have a theoretical female counterpart. I mean, you can't really pinpoint who is surplus and who is not surplus. But there are many men who have trouble finding wives if they want them. And China already has a booming industry of marriage agencies for various reasons. I mean, this is one I visited in Suining, where the director was actually very concerned about the gender imbalance, and she thought it would be a big problem, and she said she was already having trouble finding wives for some men. But these are essentially dating agencies. The goal is, they talk a little bit more about marriage, but the goal is to find partners. And you see now in villages in China, even these sort of black ads, they're called, like characters stenciled on walls, advertising marriage agencies. In a lot of places, these are quite common. And in South Korea and Taiwan, where men have, sex selection has been happening since the early 1980s, and because of some other trends as well, there's a large proportion of rural men who are having trouble finding wives. A lot of women have left, and then if you add sex selection on top of it, it's a big issue for them. So because they have a bit more money, they are able to go abroad and find wives. There are agencies that set up marriage tours, they're called, where a man can pay around $10,000. He can get a flight to Vietnam and room and board, and also a wife on the other end. I mean, it's really not. It's like the mail order bride industry here. It's not, any better or worse, I would say, except for the difference that it's much more common. And I mean, it's like your brother and your best friend and your the guy down the street all getting mail order brides, and then the women setting up even communities. And there's a little Saigon outside Taipei now, and this couple is I met them outside Taichung in Taiwan. Wen Timai Chao was 20 when they got married and had an elementary school education and she'd never really left her, been farther than Ho Chi Minh City and had not seen much of the world at all. And then she married Cheng Ting-Huang, who is 31. He is a farmer, but actually pretty educated, pretty worldly Taiwanese guy. And they did not speak the same language when they got married. I think this photo says a lot. I think it was very difficult for both of them, maybe especially for her. And I met them a few years later. They were doing all right, but I think for many couples it's quite hard. For the families many families essentially sell their daughters. So they take the money. The $10,000, most of it goes to the agency. The family maybe gets $1,000 or $2,000. But that's enough, actually, that Vietnamese sociologists have done studies on this, and they've found that the families who have daughters abroad in the Mekong Delta, most of the women coming from the Mekong Delta, have more motor scooters. They're more likely to own motor scooters, cell phones, TVs. I mean, you name it. They're doing better than their neighbors. So there's some money being made off of this trade, this marriage trade. It's sadly, I think, led to a world in which the more middle class, wealthier people, people in Eastern China, people in northwestern India, are having boys, and then poor families are then supplying them with women, and I think that's a very sad effect. There are a number of horror stories associated with this trade as well. There was a famous case in Vietnam of 220 women being held in 7 hotel rooms, waiting for men to come view them. They're indentured against their the amount of time that they're held. So if they sit on the shelf for longer, they cost more. There was a case in Taiwan of 2 Vietnamese women being put up for sale on eBay. There was a lot of outcry about these cases, but there's a lot of abuse. And then there are also incidences of women being trafficked, kidnapped. Not ostensibly being sold by your parents is also a form of trafficking, but women who are tricked, who don't go willingly. This is the most recent trafficking in persons report from the U.S. State Department, and it mentions the skewed sex ratio in China as a cause of trafficking in and around China. So I think in the end, of course, so these big side effects for women now. You have this kind of double discrimination of, first of all, fewer women being born, and then for those women who are born, especially in rural areas and in poorer countries, they're more at risk of being trafficked, more at risk of being sold. For some women, for women in more urban areas, wealthy areas, this may be, they may have a better pick, more guys to choose from when it comes time to get married. But for many women, they're really disadvantaged as a result of, there being fewer of us. So that's one issue. But then in the end, maybe there won't be enough women for all the men. So we will have also a society where men significantly outnumber women. This is a sort of dystopic Indian film called Mathrubhumi. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And the plot was that you had a village where people kept selecting for boys. Eventually, there are no girls left, no women left. So this father has 5 sons, and they're trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, he buys a woman for his 5 sons from another area, and the sons share the woman. This is something that's happening in very isolated cases. I wouldn't say it's common by any means. But here you see actually John Postgate's prediction of polyandry, women married to multiple men, and it's not as fun as some people might think. This is an issue for society as well, potentially. I mean, it's really difficult to know what will happen, right? Because we've never had a society where the sex ratio is as skewed as it will be in parts of the developing world. And demography is also, the history of demography is full of lots of conjecture and maybe sensationalism too about what could come. But we do have this example from American history of the Wild West, which is, it's not a perfect example by any means, but it is interesting in the fact that men significantly outnumbered women. You had, and it wasn't, I mean, the Wild West was not as romantic as Hollywood Westerns might make it seem. You had actually a lot of disease, a lot of crime, murder rates were soaring. And if you look at sex ratios at the time, I actually have seen a sex ratio map of the West at the time. That it looks pretty similar to the child sex ratio map for China now. In California, you had 3 men for every 2 women. This was 1870. Nevada, you had 3. It was 3 to 1. Idaho was 4 to 1. Western Kansas was 7 to 1. And there were actually reformers at the time who thought that the solution was to ship in women. There was one woman who named Eliza Farnham, who got the idea to gather a ship of women from the East Coast, and women who had recommendations from their preacher. That was the requirement, and sail around Cape Horn and then end up in California. And in the end, she couldn't find anybody who wanted to go. But in any case, it's hard to say, but there will probably be societal implications, and I think that's something that governments are starting to deal with. I mean, I think the Chinese government, the Indian government are both concerned about the skewed sex ratio, and one thing that's cited now is the potential societal effects. Recently, there's been a lot of good news, actually, when it comes to sex selection and to the attention that it's getting. The World Health Organization came out with a report just in June. This is an interagency statement signed by several other UN agencies, also the United Nations Population Fund, the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, the UNICEF. They all signed on to this statement. So that's a start. Actually, there have been, I think there's been a lot of research coming from the UN, but not a lot of action on sex selection. And there's definitely room for a lot more. The World Bank, recent World Bank Development Report, it was released, I think, a few weeks ago, and it also cited skewed sex ratios a skewed sex ratio at birth as a big concern when it comes to the status of women in other countries, and I mean that's a big step, because you often see reports looking at women's rights that completely ignore the sex ratio at birth, and it's something that should be factored in. And then the Council of Europe actually just came out with a report on sex selection in the Caucasus countries, and there's not that much known about it. I went to Albania in my research, but there's really hasn't been that much on the Caucasus countries, and there's been some denial too on the part of governments. So that's a good first step. But still, I found in these reports not much focus on the technology and where it's going, and on the ways in which sex selection is a global issue and is a very kind of contemporary issue that has to do with our this notion of control over reproduction. And this is, the history has shown that it's much better to consider the effects of technology as it's before it's introduced, or as it's introduced, rather than afterward. And to some degree, it's hard to know, but with sex selection, I think we do know quite a bit about this. So again, the U.S. developed PGD, contributed to developing IVF, and now has very lenient regulations governing it. You're not allowed to select for sex during IVF in Europe, most of Europe, and clinics offering PGD for sex selection are being set up in the developing world. This is from an Indian fertility clinic that offers PGD. I was told, how people are selecting for sex now in South Korea. So I think we need to start anticipating these developments and look at technology really as a kind of as a global phenomenon. The pace of dissemination now is so rapid. So I hope that more people are moved to act, and hope this has been useful for you. And maybe I can take some questions now. Yeah.
In the large cities in China, for example, how has life changed for young, educated women who do not want to become mothers right away, who want to get a job and have an economic future? Has it affected their ability to get a job, select good jobs? I understand some husbands are selected based on how much money they make, that sort of thing.
Well, one of the contradictory, but also one of the sad things about sex selection is that it is happening at a time when in urban areas women in Asia are doing very well and becoming very successful, and you see very I think more women, I'm not absolutely sure, but I think there were more women than men admitted to PhD programs in China this year. And across Asia, Taiwan, South Korea as well, you see this issue of many women taking on professional careers and kind of putting off marriage, not having kids, kind of the guys falling behind a little bit, similar to what's happening in New York. I don't know if it's happening in Ann Arbor, but it is. You do see these things happening at the same time, and I would say for those women, the issue of marriage is becoming very commercialized in China, and people demanding a house and a car, 有房有车. I don't know if that's. I would say that connects to kind of materialism. And maybe women in cities can also be a little bit more demanding because there are fewer women on the whole. But by and large, I think the effects of the gender imbalance are for women in rural areas and in poor countries who are at risk of then being transported to the wealthier areas. I don't know if that. Yeah.
To bring like the idea that first it was first originated in Western countries, and then the concept of sex selection migrated to the East. So I really appreciate However, it seems like in today's time, the idea of sex selection is very, it seems to be distanced from the West. The Westerners, they don't want to acknowledge the fact that it's happening within the West as it's happening in the East. It's become more of an immigrant issue than something that had originated from the land that they came to know of. I just wanted to know your perspective as to when you mention how Australia is abandoning the advertisements of the advertising of the PGD techniques. I'm wondering, are they abandoning them for a certain group of people, or the process of commercialization is abandoned for everyone in Australia? If that's something that's also true for other Western countries.
Oh, not that advertising is banned, but it's actually. Oh, sorry, I should repeat the question. So the question was. I'm not sure I can capture all of it at once, but that I portrayed sex selection as something that is a global issue, but on the other hand, when it's still popularly seen as a kind of immigrant issue. So then your question is, I think, countries that mentioned Western countries that do ban PGD for sex selection, and what? Are they banning for some group of people? Yeah, it's actually, I think Australia as well bans. They're considering it recently somehow, PGD for sex selection. But most of Western Europe, PGD is illegal. You're not allowed to do it for sex selection. Even if you want to do it for certain diseases and conditions, you need to go before a board. It's not just freely offered. There's a complicated story there. I think in the West, the fertility industry is very. The U.S. fertility industry is exceptional among Western countries. It's been called the Wild West of fertility treatments here. That's in part because we have a private healthcare system, and because fertility treatments have become a way to make money for doctors. So if the state has to pay for it, they may deem something like selecting the sex of your child just because you want to not an important enough reason for them to pay. I do think also I think in Europe a bit more hesitant about going forward with some of these techniques. I have heard of doctors in the UK discriminating during ultrasounds based on how a couple looks. Oh, sorry. So denying in South Asian people of South Asian descent in particular there are stories that they have trouble finding out the sex of their fetus if they want, and I mean I think it's problematic for doctors to decide who looks and like they will select for sex. But it is an issue that's much more discussed in Europe, and in the U.S. Sex selection unfortunately gets extremely wrapped up in the abortion debate, and it's like I think become very difficult to disconnect the two. That even because that's actually another reason why we kind of offer unfettered choice, consumer choice, when it comes to the fertility industry, and that's because in the 1980s, when some of these techniques were first being discussed and first being introduced, abortion politics were already so contentious that there was hesitancy about putting any restrictions on what people might do during reproduction, that it would set a precedent for curtailing abortion rights. So, yeah?
So I have a question about, I guess it's sort of this key finding that you see in these countries like China, but also in other places around the world, the preference for boys. Because I understand, the story that you're telling about there were these old values, then there was Western population control, and there was technology. But in most cases, I think we expect that the technology catches up with, the technology comes as social values are changing. And so, like when we go to Shanghai and we say, well, in Shanghai this really doesn't exist because people want boys and girls equally. And even in the West, where we say, or I might think, this is objectionable that people choose for blue-eyed kids, I don't worry so much about the gender imbalance because I think that probably balances out. Some people want boys, some people want girls. So what explains still now in places like China or Korea, for example, the preference for boys? I don't really understand it if it's something, unless it's something old, the old story about preference for boys.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, the specific reasons why people would want a boy vary from one place to the next. So, I mean, it could be that you want a boy to carry on the family line, or that. The question was, so why do people want boys if this? The technology is introduced and enables them to get boys, but there's this underlying preference there, and certainly you have places where people could freely use this technology, but it can kind of balance out, as in the U.S. So what's happening? Like why do they want them? The reasons vary from place to place. I mean, it could be carrying on the family line. It could be the son sweeps your grave. Son performs ancestor rites when you're dead. Could be that the son is the one who would take care of you in old age. That the daughter would marry out, or in India that. The reason often given is that the dowries have become very expensive and have kind of skyrocketed recently, and that's made daughters very expensive. And those reasons are definitely there, and there are, I would say they're just, you can read lots of books on them. There's a lot of research that's been done on this, and this is if you read articles on sex selection, often if you read about China, you often get an explanation that talks about a son caring for the parents and about ancestor rights. And if you read about India, you get often the article will talk about dowry and a daughter being expensive. But I felt that there is a kind of global something happening that was common to these different countries, and so I didn't go into that as much in my book for that reason. I mean, it felt I think we had to explore then how does this happen in all of these places at once, and sure, changing the values would definitely help. Like if people didn't value boys more than girls, you would not have a skewed sex ratio at birth. On the other hand, I do think that this general issue of selection is one that has to be discussed because whatever the prevailing values are in the world, we could select in favor of whatever is valued. If you have a world in the future where girls are much more valued. Do we let people select for girls? And there's some evidence that people are doing that in the U.S. actually. Is that I think just as a science reporter and as somebody interested in the bioethical discussions that go on around new technologies, that some conversation has to be had. And actually, those conversations did go on a little bit by the 1980s. In the 1960s, you were having like a totally different conversation, and maybe if there had been more women involved in the population movement, and maybe more of a kind of bioethics framework for discussing these issues, that we would have had a different result. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
It seems that now, with the trend, parents of boys may soon have to pay a dowry to get a bride.
So she said it seems like with the current trend, parents of boys may soon have to pay to get a bride. But that that is happening in some places. Dowries have gone down in some parts of India. I mean, there was a sociologist who told me this is one of the positive effects of the gender imbalance, is that some cases the marriages are happening without dowry in places where they did before, and you have women also being bought. But I don't know. There's been a speculation that as women become scarce, economists in particular like to talk about this. As women become scarce in supply, the demand for them goes up. They become more valuable as a result, and that's happened to a degree. But the main problem is that they're not controlling their own value in a lot of cases. So people are selling them. So. Hi.
In all these discussions of selective abortion, sometimes I feel whether the demographic risks are a little bit exaggerated. Marriage has been quite universal in China, in other Asian countries, and much higher than in Europe for centuries. So if marriage rate goes down a little bit, and that's probably not unexpected, as you said, in big cities, in Taiwan, Korea, many professional women don't get married. So with time, maybe the norm of universal marriage will change also. Another thing, the examples you give that Taiwanese men have to marry Vietnamese women, those international, transactions or marriage transactions may result more from the norm of hypergamy than anything else. So a lot of high status women refuse to marry equal low status men, as women's social status increased dramatically over the decades. So you have so many women with PhDs and college education. They do have difficulty finding husbands. So you do have access problem in cities, among professionals or women. So it's not numbers, it's not lack of women per se, it's just another norm of hypergamy that prevents universal marriage.
Okay, so let me repeat the points. The first one is that then maybe some of the effects of sex ratio imbalance can be exaggerated, because first of all, in China, you've had nearly universal marriage rates over time, and compared with the West, where we're now the percentage of people who don't get married, and so if a smaller proportion of people get married in China, it may not be such a big deal. There's more room to give. And the second is that in Taiwan and Korea, the hypergamy, like women marrying up, women. I'm not sure how hypergamy plays in this case, but that women are going to cities, getting more professional careers, and they are earning PhDs, having trouble getting married, and that leaves men in rural areas without wives. And so there's other things going on there. Because the women with PhDs have trouble getting married. That's the issue. And that's definitely true. It's certainly true. And you have these other trends go on. But on the other hand, I did speak with demographers in Taiwan who connected the sex ratio imbalance as another factor that then contributes to men having trouble getting married. So you have these other phenomena happening at the same time, and then you reduce the number of women on top of it. I think it makes it very difficult. And one thing that's, one sad aspect of the sex ratio imbalance is that it is the people in the urban areas or developing more middle class areas who select at first, and so it starts there, and then the people who might feel the effects would be the rural men or people in poorer countries. So it's not. It also kind of delays action to some degree. I mean, I think if your son does not have trouble getting married, if you can still find a wife from elsewhere, or maybe not get married in your own city, it's not such an issue, then maybe it delays people worrying about it for 10 to 20 years. Yes.
Does anybody consider the genetics over time, if this continues? Women are very bright, right? In a modern technical society, they will go for the brightest guy who has the high job. And this, in modern technical society, this is an intelligent guy. So this means that there will be taken out of the pool of men who produce the less bright men. But over several generations, there is a chance it's going to increase IQ.
Okay, the question was, has anyone considered the genetics of this, genetic effects of this, in that women tend to marry up to hypergamy again, and tend to marry more intelligent guys, brighter guys, and pick the better ones in the bunch. So if the less intelligent men cannot get married, then their genes will be out of the mix, and that over time maybe we would become more intelligent. I don't know if anybody's considered that. That's an interesting question. The effects on birth rates were considered pretty early on. I mean, I found a discussion from 1970 at the Population Association of America about what the effects would be. I'm assuming because women are the ones who reproduce. So what happens when you reduce that group? Turns out you have much lower birth rates over time as a result. But the effects on the intelligence of the human race, I don't know.
I have a question. My question is that sometimes it doesn't matter, whether a man or woman is intelligent or not. But I'm just wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what the overall global trends have been when the overall global economy is down and people can't find jobs and people can't, people are not able to find jobs, but they do have the, desire to settle down, but because of the economy the way it is, what effect does that have on mate selection and as a result, sex selection of babies? Can you talk a little bit about the economy?
Okay, so the question was what the effects of the economy on sex selection, and whether when economic downturns has any effect on people selecting for sex. I am not so sure. I mean, I could say that this is something that's happening in developing countries, but beyond that, yeah. You had a question? I think?
Yeah, the question that I had was, I was wondering if people, because of the imbalance, if they start marrying younger and younger women, is there any data to support that? I noticed that in your example, where he was 31, he brought back a bride that was 20, and I was wondering that as the population of people your own age kind of diminished, do men then seek younger and younger women? Do we see that for marriage when they're marrying younger?
No. Do you want to answer that?
Evidence
Yeah.
go both ways. So age of marriage keeps going up for men and women, but the gender gap also is getting bigger in the last 10 years. So you do see a widening gap between husband and wife for the last 10 years. But the reason is economic, social, not demographics. Not because there's not enough women, but because men are not established enough. In the pressure for establishing a household is higher now, so they couldn't afford to be married early on. And also, another is actually, Mara hasn't mentioned, is also there's more tolerance towards premarital sex. That also, cohabitation is on the rise. So a lot of people just live together without getting a marriage license. That happens a lot in cities.
Did you all hear that? Anybody? Yeah? Okay.
So you didn't say anything about the possibility of that some of these men will be gay. I mean, if it were
Yeah.
true that 10% of men anyway are,
Mm-hmm.
then 15% of men not having female counterparts becomes less of a problem. And there's a lot of evidence that anyway homosociality varies. The schoolboys in Eton and so forth who spent 18 years with each other seem to have experimented with one another at a rate of about 30%. In mixed schools, that doesn't happen so much. But if you threw these 15% of men into society like this, you might actually have an increased homosociality as a result of social pressures and inability to find women and so forth. But it seems to me that your analogy to the Old West is flawed, I would say, as a historian, just because those were gender unbalanced communities in a situation of low institutionalization, which had to do with the frontier. I'm suggesting to you that the better model for understanding the future might be contemporary San Francisco.
So the issue was that I didn't discuss the issue of whether when you have more men unable to find female partners, whether they would have male partners, whether more men would become gay, but whether more men would have sex with men. And that is something that is actually, I've heard that gay groups in China are interested in. I talked to a demographer who said that she'd been approached from a GLBT group about, like they were very interested in research on the gender imbalance. I think it's actually would be a benefit for gay men who are now maybe face pressure to get married to women, and it can be a lot of social pressure in countries like China, still maybe lessening, but to kind of keep a marriage to maintain appearances. On the other, so for those men, it could be a good thing. On the other hand, could be negative for lesbian women who would then face more pressure to marry men or to. So I don't know. That's my speculation. I didn't actually interview that group. I heard about kind of late in the process of my book. But yeah, it's a good point. Yep.
What are some policies that governments are trying to implement to solve this problem, if any, like China or countries like China?
Well, the question was, what are some policies that governments are using to confront the issue of sex selection? There is a lot of concern about the issue. I'd say in China and India in particular, there like the Caucasus countries, not really any recognition of the issue. Same with Albania, but also South Korea, Vietnam have really recognized the issue. In South Korea now, the sex ratio of birth is balanced, so it's not such an issue. But well, first of all, sex selection and also sex determination has been illegal since the 1990s in both countries, in both China and India, I believe. And so it's illegal to know the sex of your baby. I think in China it's not fully criminalized, but it is illegal. A lot of people get around it. Which is the problem, and I think there's not much emphasis on enforcing the law. But particularly in India, since the most recent census came out this spring and showed that the sex ratio of birth is on the countrywide went up, and also some has spread to new states within India where it wasn't so skewed before. And the government, there's been a lot of government leaders talking about what to do. There are all kinds of schemes to pay people to have girls. I don't know that this a great strategy by and large, because it doesn't address maybe the issue of middle-class parents for whom a payment is not going to sway them one way or the other. There's the University of Bangalore, I think, offers a affirmative action for single daughters. So when they don't have a brother, you can assume that sex selection didn't happen. Maybe it did, but so it reserves places for those girls, and that, I think, is a policy that maybe is a bit more directed at the people who might actually be selecting. So I think that kind of policy has potential to work. By and large, though, I think maybe not so much initiative within the governments, but it is growing. There is each census that shows that it's getting worse or shows that it's moving to a new area, that kind of, people get worried. Yeah.
Actually, one of the other things the government has done is to tie evaluations of performance to sex balance in the region. This is important because previously, performance evaluation is purely based on fertility. If it's high fertility region, you get a low evaluation. And as a result of that, there is an underreporting of new babies in most counties, rural areas. If there's high fertility, officials try to hide babies from statistical reporting systems. So a lot of those underreported babies are actually girls. And a few years later, so every census, after 10 years, you find new babies who started to appear in the system at age 5 and 6. When they started to go to schools, they appear in government statistics. And a lot of that's why there's a little bit over-reporting of sex imbalance, because babies are more likely to be underreported from year 0, especially year 0, but from 0 to 6 for that reason. And because officials are afraid of reporting too many babies in their jurisdiction.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Matt.
Just wondering if you could tell us about the prices of black market sex determination and black market abortions in places where they're illegal in relation to incomes. How much of a financial hit is it for people doing these things?
So the question was how much it costs to get the ultrasound and get sex determination during ultrasound and abortion. I had heard that it was in Swaning, where the place I mentioned earlier. I'd heard the total cost was around 1,000 yuan. This was a few years ago. Maybe it's gone up. I don't know if it's what it would be now. That would be, I don't know. Can anyone calculate the exchange rate quickly? I haven't been in China recently. What? 1,000? Yeah. 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 120, 130? Yeah, $130. So I don't know in India. I'm not sure. And how it would work, or if anyone in the audience have? Yeah.
I think in India it's illegal to even find information regarding sex detection. But I've had friends who've done that for me, and so the facility itself is not available or accessible to the Canadian audience. But you can definitely go abroad and have it done and come back. And it costs about $200 for detection. I'm not sure about abortion. I'm sure it must be expensive too, actually. It will be around that.
So in India, around $200 to get detection, and yeah. Yeah, I also heard about people bribing the ultrasound technician in China with cigarettes, with what like a case of cigarettes, good cigarettes. One more question? I think we have time for.
Has there been a rise in infertility in women who have undergone abortions?
A rise in the question is, has there been a rise in infertility among women who've undergone? I can't answer that question. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we're going to stop here, but I want to thank Mark for talking.
Yeah.